brief introduction to Mobliciti and a little bit about, I find it quite interesting that we're talking about identity today, and it's very noticeable if you actually look at the slides and the way things work. A lot of what you talk about in identity now is actually the smartphone in people's pockets. That's often a combination of corporately provided devices, but also bring your own. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of bring our view of mobile security along as well, and also a brief introduction to ourselves at Mobliciti. So I'm the CTO at Mobliciti. I look after all of our technology strategy and partnerships. I also have all the operational side of the business line into me to deliver all of our managed services for our customers. What's been interesting for me is about 7 years ago, I came over from customer land. So I was the global head of mobile for HSBC. So I was looking after about 75,000 handsets in 80 countries at one point. So I've got a lot of experience in terms of the world of mobile, and that actually has built on experience that I built up in the world of Windows before that. So I'm old enough to remember rolling out with the first Windows NT build into HSBC, to give you an idea of how far back that goes. I jumped ship after I rolled out XP. It was time to do something different. So in terms of what we'll be covering today, there's a few things here. Obviously, a brief introduction to us. What I think is happening in the mobile space at the moment is what we see quite commonly with customers is it's quite a complex environment, mobile, and very often it's built up over time. So sometimes it's useful to actually go back and look at why we've ended up in the position we are. And so I'll take you on a bit of a journey there, and actually what that kind of means, I suppose, as what we see as common legacy of that, and problems that are very real in the estate today. Also talk a little bit about how attackers and the threats are growing in the mobile space. And you know, it's logical when you think about it, as these have become more prevalent as endpoints, so have attacks on them. So I'll talk very briefly about our services, so Virtual Mobile Manager, which is what we do to actually help customers with getting control over the environment from all kind of angles. So without further ado, quickly about us. For those of you who don't know us, we were founded back in 2009, and it really was our vision to think about mobile and cloud, which at the time was fairly innovative. And so the delivery of all of those solutions, in particular into an enterprise context. So we think about the pro services, in particular legal and finance have been core areas for us. And increasingly it's about actually delivering services for our customers. So we're pleased to say we've won a number of awards in that space. If you really boil down what we do, ultimately we're about connecting and securing endpoints. So we call them mobile devices. That's increasingly any device. If you think about the way laptop deployment has changed, if you think about the way Mac, for example, is coming to the party as well. So we talk about how do you actually get these devices securely connected through to data increasingly using cloud services. To give you an idea of scale, the team back running in the managed service center, we've got over 80,000 endpoints that we're being managed now. In terms of the technology and service proposition that we have, I'll build that out quickly because there's a lot there. What we'll focus in on is, if you like, our heartland, so the mobility stack in particular, but we help customers on all kinds of things. In particular, probably another area for another day, wireless has become a massive thing with the return to the office, so helping actually organise the wireless infrastructure and get that deployed effectively and cloud managed. So let's touch on, if you like, the history. So the once upon a time. So not that long ago, the world of, if you like, desktop and mobile were totally segregated. Mobile phones were dumb devices, and logically they would just be something that was almost bought like a commodity. And all of that got very complicated around, I'll say 2003, 2005, something like that. What we found was this came along. So if you're old enough to remember these, this was one of the big JFDI projects that came from the top of an organization, and everybody had to deploy them rapidly. And they were, at one point, the ultimate status symbol. It seems incredible now when you actually try to find a high-res image of one is actually quite hard. The interesting thing about BlackBerry is it came along and it didn't quite fit the mold. they actually had quite a lot of security controls on them for what is effectively an email device. And I think this is one of the early things that's happened, is if you actually break down what does enterprise mobile mean for a lot of organizations, the answer is still basically it's an email device. That's what BlackBerry did very effectively, but clearly not that long after BlackBerry kind of dominated in the market, and you know, it's easy to forget just how big BlackBerry were, this came along. So the first iPhone was a really interesting moment because a lot of enterprise admins kind of looked at this device and said, well, it looks cool, but nah, we'll carry on. And it was kind of really fascinating because this is roughly where Mobliciti come in, is because we started to see that actually end users were demanding something different in the estate. And that noise just got louder and louder until you got, in around 2010, the iPad first hit. And this was the next big JFDI project. Suddenly, lots and lots of organizations wanted to get the Apple devices out, front of house in particular, to actually get them working. It was all about, you know, adopting the Apple coolness, if you like, into your environments. Again, though, the interesting thing was they didn't fit the traditional mold. And this is obviously where mobile device management first came along. It was the first levers you could pull in terms of how to actually start to manage and secure these endpoints. But they were pretty limited in terms of scope and scale. And what that meant was mobile devices have never really inherited security posture from the traditional endpoint. They've kind of challenged it at every step along the way. There's a few nodding heads as I'm saying this. And what was particularly interesting in terms of what comes next is what the iPad really did start to usher in was the age of the app. So, you know, the thing that wasn't on the original iPhone was actually an app store. It just wasn't there. That came a little bit later. But that was actually the revolutionary moment, and indeed the thing that changed adoption completely. But it's built up rather a large legacy of problems. And I think this is the thing that most of the mobile estates that we go into and talk to customers about, it's grown organically over time to a certain extent. We've seen mobile is still generally considered something a little bit different from desktop. Still very often considered an email device, and in terms of security, people think of it still as an email device. The reality is, though, it's not a separate thread to the desktop. It's effectively an endpoint now. In fact, in some ways, it's a very, very powerful endpoint, more powerful in some ways than a desktop itself. The precedence for its deployment was set in the world of email, and this is one of the things that we always talk about. And I think people tend to think of these devices are they have a subset of capability compared to, if you like, full fat your Windows endpoints. The truth is that now, if you think about the security of these devices, it's effectively the same. Yeah, the idea that it's mainly used for email is actually wrong now. I think, don't get me wrong, email is still incredibly important, and the more senior the person in the organization, the more likely that they absolutely will need their email in a timely manner. But the reality is it's now a platform. It's something that's being used for all kinds of things, not least authenticator, identity, the Microsoft stack. These are all things that have now totally lit up devices. We've got loads of conversations going on at the moment with people because one of the interesting things people have in their data plans and their voice minutes when they're talking about their estate is if you think, you know, I've got unlimited minutes. But very often, I haven't got unlimited data. During the pandemic, everybody switched from traditional voice calls to doing everything over video. It was one of the great legacies of lockdown, is the fact that people are now video first in their comms. They're now back out there in the world, and what was traditionally a voice call is now a data overlay of a video call, which is incredibly data hungry. And so we're seeing bill shock going through the roof. The other thing that I always touch on here is the legacy is that the mobile operating systems themselves are different. They are designed to be different, and the way that you have to deal with the security of those operating systems is different. So Apple, generally, the end user is king. So it's not like a device you can just manage, lock down, control. You've got to actually bring the user into the journey of how do you actually manage and secure these devices. If you don't, then you just get a build-up of problems over time. Also, interestingly, is the Android space. Now, Android is, in many ways, should be the leader in the enterprise space because they give enterprise customers, enterprise security teams in particular, lots more levers to pull in terms of the way to control, lock down, secure. But actually, what's their Achilles heel is patching. And both of these operating systems, it's now patching that is the number one problem you're going to have. Just simply because every security patch has to be deployed rapidly. And Android's Achilles heel has always been the fragmentation of its ecosystem. The way patching is done is dependent on handset manufacturers, dependent on OEMs, dependent on all kinds of variables, including carriers sometimes in the mix. Apple broke that model, which is why everybody in the world gets the update at the same time. It's incredibly powerful, but it's also incredibly hard to keep a lid on as well. There's the downside to it in terms of change adoption ahead of what IT would like to control ideally. In the world of mobile security, I think a quick Google search will tell you that the threat on mobile now is growing exponentially. There is a perception that we still see that iOS is secure in particular. There's sometimes Android as well, but this concept of iOS is secure, it's well architected software, but the idea that it's more secure, I think, is increasingly being proved a fallacy. That some of the patches that have come out in the last 6 months, these are really dangerous exploits. You can go from literally loading a web page to having a completely compromised device. And a compromised mobile device is pretty scary stuff that, not only have you got all the data exfiltration capabilities, but this thing is a sensor. It's got location, it's got microphones, it's got cameras, the genuinely scary, sort of like Secret Service level stuff does happen when you're looking at the world of mobile security. And so what this means is you've got to patch, and you've got to patch fast, and it's a monolithic giant patch every time. It's not like you can just put a feature update in for something specific. You've got to just go for it and update constantly. And if you don't, then things like Cyber Essentials will kick in and tell you, well, you've got to be doing this. It also creates an interesting challenge around the world of device ownership, bring your own device versus corporately provided. But the point here is it's getting harder, and it's not going to get any easier. The reality is that users are more susceptible on mobile endpoints and are more targeted now, precisely because it's exactly where things like the identity is. It's exactly where their banking is. It's literally people's lives they're being targeted now. I thought it'd be really interesting, just briefly, this is obviously a very busy side, but if you look at sort of MITRE ATT&CK world, I think one of the things that we often hear is, I've got Intune, I've got the ability to manage my devices, therefore I am secure. And the point we make is, that is part of what you need, but a UEM can only do so much of that attack framework, if you really look at it. And I think one of the things that, if there's any takeaway from today I'd recommend, is to consider whether you need to have additional protection on mobile endpoints to bring them into line with what you would do on a Windows device, for example. So in the mobile space, that's something like Defender for mobile, or alternative mobile threat defense solutions. This is a whole area that we assist customers with, because fundamentally the whole point is, once you've got an agent on there and you've actually got the ability to gain much more data about what's going on the endpoint and actually detect compromise happening in real time, then clearly you start to cover much more of this framework off. So mobile security, one of the things we always make is, points we always make is mobile operating systems, they're still software at the end of the day. They can be compromised. They are being compromised. And indeed, as with all things, there is a market for compromises on mobile operating systems. If you can get to root level access with a compromise on a mobile device, that's a very, very expensive exploit that can be sold. And indeed they are. There is also the fact that you've got whole communication chains going on now on a mobile endpoint that bypass your traditional security. And the classic example I have is email security is something that has been put in place for a long time, very mature, very capable, and actually blocks, the vast majority of attacks that will be coming towards your organization. But the reality is now, an SMS or a WhatsApp can just go right round the side of it, and you've got no protection at all. You don't even know, unless you've got something on your mobile endpoints telling you, you don't even know if someone's actually clicked on the link or not. The level of threat on a mobile device is fascinating because if you think about it, it's an internet-connected endpoint that is constantly on, it's always on. People never turn these devices off, and they are having to, they're also, the way users work is they will always be hunting around for Wi-Fi. People have been taught to do it over time. That kind of behavior is risky in itself. Users, as I say, they're trained to seek out Wi-Fi. And if there's one key takeaway, users just simply are more vulnerable on a mobile device. And it's not just their faults, but simply a smaller screen, smaller real estate, you're less likely to see, for example, a malformed URL. It will look much more plausible on a mobile device. But there is simply the fact, and this came up yesterday, people are more likely to just say yes to something, and it was kind of like spamming someone for authenticator access until they just gave up, just said yes to make the problem go away. These things do happen. So the way we go about helping customers with this is ultimately what we call our virtual mobile manager stack. And the key for us is to actually solve the whole problem. So everything from the provision and supply and security and patching of devices, managing carrier and airtime as well. Often we see that the airtime agreement that's obviously aligned to the supply of devices, these tend to be something that are bundled together, will be an area where there are ways to manage it much more effectively and get spend under control. Carriers on the whole, they make a good business out of people going over their allowances, shall we say, as people now know in their personal lives as well. UEM strategy, we do a lot of work helping customers potentially move to Intune for the mobile estate, but also to run it on their behalf, because this is not fit and forget technology. It's something that needs feeding and watering on a constant basis. Thinking about how to securely get devices back behind firewalls to corporate resources, or potentially how do we secure access into cloud services from mobile endpoints, something that we work alongside customers with. And then finally we layer on top mobile threat defense solutions and manage those as well, because this is a whole new area of threat information and data that needs to again be looked at. This will be different to the way that the data streams come in from a Windows endpoint, for example. And ultimately, we bundle all of that. We've got skills in all of these various areas. That means we can actually take the entire problem off your hands. So, quick summary, really. I think, if there's any takeaways I can give you, it's mobile isn't just for email anymore, clearly. It's getting harder. The challenges that we're seeing in the mobile space are not going to get easier over time. It's getting harder and harder, and the security of it is really crucial. Try and think about, how do I get parity on a mobile endpoint with what I'm doing on my desktop estate? Do patch. If there's one thing you must absolutely do, is every single time a security release, which is pretty much every release of a mobile operating system comes out, you need to get it out of into your estate. And that is an element of carrot and stick sometimes when it comes to actually encouraging users to do it. And ultimately, we're here to potentially help with that. We can have a conversation to talk about the entire mobile problem and how best to manage it better going forwards, and how we can take some of the heavy lifting off your hands.